On the high Arctic ice, the first strike of the pickaxe made a hollow sound. Not the dull crunch of snow, but the hard, ringing knock of metal buried deep below. The men froze where they stood, breath clouding in the cold, realizing they had struck something that did not belong there. Wind scraped across the glacier as they widened the opening, chips of blue ice spraying beneath their boots. Slowly, a curved shape emerged from the frozen wall, smooth, riveted, unmistakable. The wing of an aircraft lay sleeping under 80 years of winter headlamps carved yellow tunnels through the frozen dark. Beneath the glassy surface, paint still clung to the metal, faded yet clear enough to read a white star, a serial number. The war had ended generations ago, but here, frozen in silence, one machine had never been told. They worked in careful rhythms, cutting and brushing, melting and lifting. Steam mingled with snow as heaters blasted warm air into the wound in the glacier. Bit by bit, the aircraft slid into view, whole and unnervingly untouched by time. When they reached the cockpit, the canopy was clouded with frost, like a dead, unblinking eye. A gloved hand wiped across the glass, revealing a faceplate, a flight stick, a cluster of intact dials. Everything looked as if the pilot had just stepped out and never returned. With a soft hiss, the canopy seal broke. A rush of ancient cold spilled out, carrying the faint smell of oil and leather. Inside, the seat belts were still buckled, pads stiff but unbroken. On the floor, a metal thermos lay on its side, unopened since the day it fell. The instrument panel was a frozen heartbeat. Needles rested over numbers as if waiting for orders. A paper checklist hung from a clip, ink still crisp on the page. One of the men flipped a switch on instinct. The toggle moved cleanly, complaining about nothing. Outside, the sky hung low in bands of gray, the sun a dim disk hovering near the horizon. The team set up generators, cables stretching across the ice like veins. No one truly believed the engine would do more than cough. Still, they checked each line as if lives depended on it. Warm air flooded the engine bay, clearing frost from gears and pipes. Old oil, trapped for decades, began to flow like heavy syrup. They replaced nothing they didn't have to, unwilling to disturb the past more than necessary. The goal wasn't to rebuild, but to wake what remained. When the preparations were complete, the valley fell into an uncanny hush. One man climbed into the cockpit, his gloves resting on the same grips the original pilot once held. Through the glass, he nodded, then reached for the starter as the world held its breath. The first turn of the propeller was slow and heavy, blades resisting the weight of frozen years. The engine coughed once, then died. On the second attempt, it spun faster, pistons grinding, metal remembering what it had been built to do. Something deep inside began to answer. Without warning, the engine barked to life, then settled into a rolling growl. Snow leaped from the wings in trembling sheets. Exhaust smoke rose into the Arctic air, black against white. For a moment, the team stood frozen, stunned by the sound of a war waking up. They did not shout or cheer. They listened. The steady roar echoed across the glacier, bouncing off ice walls like distant thunder. This aircraft had crashed, vanished, and been buried. Now it stood again, engine alive, defying every rule of decay. Beneath the noise was another sound, nearly lost, the quiet click of history rearranging itself. This was no scrap heap. It was a time capsule that still functioned, a machine built for battle, preserved by cold, revived by hands that had never known its war. News of the discovery traveled fast, but far to the south, another secret slept under a different kind of ice. In a remote forest lake frozen half the year, fishermen had long whispered about shapes on the bottom. A turret ring, a barrel, a tank lost to the deep. A specialized team arrived with cranes, pumps, and a cautious curiosity. They cut a wide hole in the ice, the black water yawning beneath the snow. Chains sank into the darkness until they struck steel. When the winch tightened, something enormous groaned from the lake bed. What emerged looked almost alive. A Soviet tank, coated in mud and algae, burst through the surface in a roar of water. Its armor plates were intact. Its tracks hung heavy around the wheels. A red star glared from the turret through decades of grime. Dragged onto the shore, water poured from the hatches in steady streams. When the main hatch cracked open, the air that escaped smelled of rust and diesel, but nowhere near as dead as expected. Inside the compartment was shockingly complete. Ammunition boxes sat in their straps. Tools remained in place. A canvas rucksack held rations reduced to dust. The engine block, though stained, looked almost operational. The mechanics traded glances, each wrestling with the same dangerous question. Could it still run? The idea felt wild, reckless, irresistible. They drained the fuel, cleaned the lines, poured in fresh diesel. New oil filled the engine. Batteries hummed, sending a low vibration through the hull. When they pressed the starter, the entire forest listened. The first attempt produced only a heavy whine, gears grinding against decades of sleep. On the second, the engine coughed, spitting brown water from the exhaust before falling silent. Vapor curled upward like hesitant spirits testing the air. On the third attempt, everything changed. A deep knock reverberated through the hull, followed by a rising thunder as the engine finally caught. The tank trembled under its own power, armor vibrating, plates humming. Men stepped back as history forced itself awake. Hot exhaust roared from the rear, painting the cold air with smoke. The earth beneath the tracks quivered. Insensed, the dials flickered to life, needles twitching like eyes opening after a long sleep. The tank was no relic now. It was a living machine again. One mechanic climbed into the driver's seat, hands shaking as they gripped controls worn smooth by vanished soldiers. He eased the clutch, nudged the throttle. With a groan of steel and mud, the tank rolled forward, leaving wet, heavy prints in the snow. It traveled only a few meters, but those steps were monumental. The forest watched in stunned silence as a World War II giant buried for 80 years dragged itself back into the world under its own power. No paint, no restoration, just momentum and memory. When the engine was cut, silence draped over the clearing like a heavy curtain. The tank settled, steam rising in like its final breath. It had proven all it needed to. It still worked. The rest would be up to those willing to remember why machines like this were built. News broadcasts would show the spectacle. Engines roaring, ice breaking, steel resurrected. But cameras couldn't capture the feeling. That eerie blend of awe and unease when something designed for destruction refuses to die quietly. Back at the glacier, the aircraft was prepared for transport. Wrapped in protective sheets, lifted by cables. It rose from the ice like a ghost evacuated from its own grave. Once it had flown in war. Now it traveled in silence, bound for careful hands. In workshops, far from Arctic winds, engineers and historians gathered around both machines. Under harsh white lights, every panel and rivet was studied not just as metal, but as witness, as memory, as survivors of a past human minds had nearly forgotten. The aircraft's fuselage bore tiny scratches where mechanics had once marked repairs. A name carved faintly into an interior frame belonged to a pilot who never returned. His logbook was gone, but the seat cushion still carried the subtle imprint of his last flight. Inside the tank, chalk notes lingered on the steel walls, scrawled by young men who once tried to tame their iron beast. A playing card lay wedged behind a bracket, edges softened by time. It had survived fire, water, ice, and now the eyes of a new century. The restoration teams faced a difficult decision: restore the machines to shining perfection, or preserve the scars that told their stories. In the end, they chose both, stabilizing what needed saving without erasing what made them real. The aircraft's engine would run again, but only in short, monitored bursts. Its wings would never lift into combat, only demonstrations and remembrance. The tank would move under its own power for minutes at a time, a reminder of what motion once meant. When the day of the public unveiling arrived, crowds formed. Early children pressed their faces to the glass. Veterans moved more slowly, eyes carrying memories no exhibit could match. Outside, the world felt modern, loud, distracted. Inside, time thinned to a whisper. Under spotlights, the aircraft gleamed softly, its silver skin reflecting faces tilted upward in disbelief. Plaques told the story of its crash, its burial, its rediscovery. But the real story pulsed in the air. The scent of fuel, the weight of metal, the quiet. Across the hall, the tank waited like a crouched animal. Its armor bore the stains of battle and the fresh scars of recovery. When its engine started for demonstration, the sound rolled through the building like a contained storm, rattling rafters and hearts. People covered their ears, but no one looked away. The floor vibrated faintly under their shoes as the tracks rolled a short distance, then stopped. In that brief movement, the past crossed the present, proving history does not always stay buried. When the engines cooled and the crowds thinned, the machine stood in silence again. The aircraft rested on its landing gear, nose slightly raised as if still searching for a runway. The tank sat heavy on its tracks, staring at an invisible horizon only it could see. They were not just relics of war. They were proof of what cold and time can preserve. Proof that stories buried in ice and mud can still rise, engines turning, lights flickering, voices of steel speaking across decades to those willing to listen. Somewhere, glaciers still hide wings no one has seen. Lakes cradle turrets in their black depths. The earth keeps its secrets well. But every time a pickaxe rings against hidden steel or a winch strains against something heavy below, the same thought returns. What else waits beneath the ice, perfectly preserved, still capable of waking when warm hands and curious minds dare to ask whether the past is truly gone, or simply waiting, silent and intact, for someone brave enough to turn the power back on?